In our first lesson today, Ezekiel was one of the Israelites taken captive at the fall of Jerusalem and moved from his home in Jerusalem to Babylon. Basically, his world had been destroyed, his home ransacked, his career as a priest crumbled when the temple was demolished, and he was carted off along with thousands of others and sent to Babylon. So instead of being a priest leading the people in temple worship, he became a prophet, seeing visions from God and hearing the words of God, bringing messages to the people of God in their foreign land. In this visitation of the Lord, Ezekiel is transported to a valley, and the valley is filled with bones, dry bones, that seem to have been there for centuries. And the Lord asked him, "Can these bones live?" Well, what would you say? Ezekiel said, "You know," implying that, "How should I know? You're God, you tell me." And God tells him to prophesy. Prophesy to the bones. And I can see Ezekiel thinking, wait a minute, these are bones. They got no ears to hear. Why should I waste my time? Ezekiel looks out over the valley of dry bones, hopeless, unredeemable. They represent all that is lost in Israel. The destroyed temple, the lost homes, the broken and bleeding people, the lost jobs, all of the hopeless and helpless situations that can go along with the aftermath of a conquered and defeated people. What are the hopeless situations, the dry bones in our lives today? So many possible answers out there. A bankrupt business, a failed marriage, a broken relationship, a flooded house, unfulfilled dreams, lost jobs, lost loved ones, illnesses, cancer, death, and disappointment. Ezekiel envisions all of that and more when he looks at this immense graveyard representing total destruction, desolation. But he follows what the Lord tells him to do. He begins to prophesy, and as he does, an amazing thing happens. What he prophesies begins to come true. The bones begin to rustle and they come together, and sinew and muscle appear, and the flesh covers it all. But there's no breath. And so God tells him to prophesy to the breath, the winds, the spirit. And that breath or spirit comes and enters the body, and they live, and they stand, and they are more than Ezekiel can count. You know, I was at a Eucharist once right here at Grace Church. It was just me and the priest. A side note that it happened to be my birthday, but it was a weekday Eucharist and nobody else showed up. So the priest invited me to come and stand at the altar with him. As he began the Eucharist, I was standing sideways looking at him, and I began to see this whole church begin to fill. It seemed like a whole host had come and just filled every seat in this place. If I turned and looked, it was bare, empty. But in my peripheral vision, I could see this happening. It was like every angel and every person who had ever worshiped in this place were gathered to join us in that Eucharist. So I have an idea of what Ezekiel might have felt like at this point, a very surreal experience. It makes you wonder what kind of parallel universe you've fallen into. And God says, this is the whole house of Israel. And they say, our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. But God has an answer. I am the Lord. I will open your graves and raise you up. I will put my spirit within you and you shall live. God brings hope and life out of the hopeless and helpless situations in our lives. This is the hope of Israel, the resurrection that the Pharisees claim. Here is that starting point for the kind of faith that God is calling for. This is the hope of the nations, the whole house of Israel. This is a communal hope, not an individual hope. I think maybe it's not unlike the hope of our nation as we watch the events of 9/11 and the aftermath. Out of the rubble and ashes of the Twin Towers came the determination of a diverse people. Out of the symbol of defeat came a unifying hope for a nation, that we would rise again. What Ezekiel reported seeing gave hope to a defeated nation, the hope that they would indeed live again. Some people find our current political situation almost as hopeless, but God is even in the midst of it, and He can bring hope to a hopeless generation. God does not leave us in those barren, dry, and parched places crying over dry bones. Our world cries out for that kind of hope daily, the kind of hope that brings life and resurrection. And if you have seen the Harry Potter movies, I don't remember which one it was, but in one of them, Professor Dumbledore has this bird. It's a phoenix. It wilted away and burst into flames and became a pile of ashes. Harry was devastated at having witnessed this scene, but the professor assured him that it was part of life and that the bird would indeed rise again out of the ashes. Many, many years ago, Sam and I saw a movie called The Flight of the Phoenix. In this classic tale, a plane goes down and is lost in the desert. It seems like a hopeless situation with insurmountable odds, and yet hope arises from unexpected places. It is a story of faith, faith which almost crumbles when they find out the person designing the escape aircraft isn't exactly what they think, but is only a model airplane designer. But out of hope and necessity, they pull together and overcome the odds in order to live again. These stories demonstrate a desperate need for the story of resurrection out of death, the need of a people for the kind of hope that is present in our lessons this morning, the understanding that we can live again. We need to understand that when things seem the darkest, we can still have hope because God is here with us. We find the same kind of situation in our gospel lesson today, just a smaller scale. Here is not a valley of dry bones. Here is a single person in the grave for 4 days. The 4 days seem strange to us, especially since we find Jesus himself was raised in 3 days. But 4 days is significant. The Israelites believed that the soul or spirit of a person stayed in the vicinity for 3 days before rising up to heaven. So the 4 days meant the soul had departed, making the miracle seem even more unlikely. Jesus was late, and what do we do when God doesn't come through when or like we think he should? Mary and Martha berate Jesus, Lord, if you had only been here. God doesn't always act in the way we expect. And how do we handle that? You see, Jesus had come because Jesus calls forth life even amid the conditions of death. Just as people looking out over the valley of dry bones would call it hopeless, so the family of Lazarus called the loss of their brother hopeless. And Jesus comes Not when they expect him to, not when they wanted him to, but he does come. And he comforts them, and his presence is tangible. He weeps with them at their loss. Although Martha tells Jesus that she believes that God will give him whatever he asks for, she doesn't believe that this is possible. The Spirit has already left this place. Lord, if you had only been here, our brother would not have died. In our darkest hour, Jesus comes. Jesus calls us forth from the tomb of broken hearts and disappointments, from the tomb of rejection and loneliness, from the tomb of self-loathing and meaninglessness. As humans, we fix our eyes on a goal, quite often to the exclusion of other possibilities. As humans in this world, we too often want what we want, when we want it, the way we want it. Because we've been convinced by this world that we are in control. The truth is that we're not in control. And sometimes our hopes and our dreams must die before we become capable of accepting a new idea or a new dream. Sometimes we don't see or even look for a window of opportunity that is open for us already until that door we are so focused on is slammed shut. Jesus comes to open new doors for us, to cry out with us when we are devastated, and then to help us to new understanding and new life. He comes to restore the spirit that has left our bodies. Out of the conditions of death and devastation can arise new life. See, Jesus calls forth life even amid the conditions of death. Can you hear his call? I am a recovering smoker. I smoked for 30 years. And after my first year in seminary, Jesus called me out of the tomb of destruction. I had been diagnosed as borderline emphysema, and I continued to smoke. Then I was having to use my inhaler 2 or 3 times a day, precursors to the condition of death, and yet I kept smoking. God finally told me that if I was going to live to proclaim his good news, I was going to have to come out of that tomb of death and destruction and walk in life. I quit smoking. Recovering alcoholics and recovering drug addicts can tell you the same story. Jesus calls forth life even amid the conditions of death. Please pray with me. Oh Lord, open our hearts and minds to hear you when you call, to follow you where you lead, to trust you to restore our spirit, and to bring new life and hope in all situations and in all circumstances of our lives. Amen.